Hi, everyone, and welcome back into the ConTinual panel room for our discussion of the Roaring Twenties called When the Twenties Roared. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott, and I'll start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little about their interest in the 1920s. Denny, would you please start?
Hi, my name is Denny S. Bryce. I am the author of Wild Women in the Blues, historical fiction that came out last year. I'm also the author of the book In the Face of the Sun that will be coming out in April 26th of 2022. I am a former marketing and public relations professional. I also was a professional dancer. I also am looking to start singing jazz at nightclubs because I love singing and it might be something fun to do. And then what else? I'm also a book reviewer for NPR and a professor of marketing at Drexel. And it's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. EJ?
I'm EJ Russell. I have a very checkered past. I have 2 degrees in theater. And I spent over 2 decades as a computer consultant and database designer, as one does when one has 2 theater degrees. And probably the reason that I'm so interested in certain parts of the 20s, particularly the movies, is because of those theater degrees. I write primarily gay romance. I have 31 books out now. And one of them, Silent Sin, is in fact an historical gay romance set in the early 1920s. So I think I was scarred at an early age by reading Harpo Marx's autobiography and became fascinated by vaudeville and his subsequent entry into the movies. And Harpo is actually sitting on the shelf above us. So he's the icon for my chat today.
Thank you. Jim?
I'm Jim Nettles. I write science fiction, urban fantasy, bit of horror, bit of this, that, and the other. I also write a lot of nonfiction, economics, technology, privacy, data security, marketing, this, that, and the other, some of this, that, and the other. I've not written anything about the 20s at this point, but I've done a lot of things that were influenced by the 20s and cultural influences from the 20s. But a lot of the things that I've done in terms of nonfiction is diving into those historical periods. Part of my, checkered past, as it were, is being trained in cultural anthropology and study of cultures. And, early 20th century up to about the early 50s is a really fascinating period. I mean, I've studied a lot from about the mid 1850s to to the 1950s, that century, because we see so much societal change and technological change, and it's just a fascinating period to go through. So I mean, there's a lot of influences I've pulled off of from that period of time. So it ought to be fun.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And if you've seen these panels before, you may remember that I write historical fantasy for Falstaff Books. I also write several different subgenres of romance. And with Jeannie Adams, I write the Outcast Station science fiction mystery adventure series. And so I've always been interested in the 1920s. And as I got older and began to learn more about them, I began to realize that it's a schizoid decade. On the one hand, you have flappers and sheiks and 23 Skidoo and let's party. And on the other hand, the farms are sliding quietly to the Great Depression, and there are some very unpleasant societal forces at work. So if you are concerned about those societal forces, we have decided to focus mostly on the positive tonight. So we'll take you on a fun journey through the interesting and upbeat aspects of the 1920s with maybe a little shading of the other stuff if we have time to get to it at the end. So I'd like to start by asking everybody, when you hear the phrase, the Roaring Twenties, what do you think about? Jim, you want to start us?
Jazz, gangsters, political corruption, and the Dust Bowl generally. But for me, the part of the fun of the 20s is looking at an age during which we developed really the major combustion engines and developed the automobile industry. At the same time, we were developing early rocketry. So, the number of things that came out of that period, beyond just Betty White and sliced bread, it's just a lot of fun things that we see from that period of time. And it's really kind of that cusp of what we now consider the modern era. But it was a period of, I think, of a lot of dichotomies, but I mean, it was a period of a lot of energy. And I think that's really the thing that I think of most and foremost, is everything was full of life and full of energy, even though it was often teetering kind of on the dark side of it.
Okay. EJ?
Well, as you may have guessed from my introduction, my focus, whenever I hear about the 1920s, I immediately think of the entertainment industry, specifically silent films, vaudeville, the sort of the switch from live stage, touring stage productions in vaudeville to the first onset of mass media. Because the early talkies, the early silent films, so the Nickelodeon shorts, were the first times that people, large numbers of people, could get the same message being sort of transmitted to them in a way that that was strictly popular culture as opposed to newsprint. It gave. I think it started us on the path to where we are now in terms of social media and the prevalence of electronic communication. But more than that, it was a fascinating era, and the early silent films, by all accounts, were incredibly beautiful, and also very risque. And in the early part of the decade, that was allowable until some of the incidents that scandals that happened in the early part of the decade changed the course of Hollywood and changed the course of morality, I think, for the rest of the century, and even sort of are revisiting us today. I mentioned I write primarily gay romance, and the early 1920s was actually a pretty good time to be queer in Hollywood, because if you worked for a studio, they protected you. They controlled the police, they controlled the press, and as long as you were an asset, they protected you. Elsewhere in the country, not so much.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Were you finished?
Oh,
Did you want to add anything else?
No, that's it.
Okay, sorry, Denny.
Well, what's interesting to me, what attracted me to writing about the 1920s, because that's what I write about in both of my books, first started with my grandmother, who came to this country in 1923 from Kingston, Jamaica. And she would tell me stories about when she was a young girl and doing all that. And I was always fascinated. And she had a lot of photos of herself from that time period. Then the other thing that attracted me, there was when I was dancing, I used to be a dancer in New York. And of course, as a dancer in New York, I worked as a waitress. And the place that I worked at was called the Cookery. And the Cookery was owned by a man by the name of Barney Josephson. Barney Josephson also owned Cafe Society, and that's the place where Billie Holiday first sang Strange Fruit. Our main entertainment at the Cookery when I was working there was a woman by the name of Alberta Hunter. Alberta Hunter was in her 80s making a comeback, but in the 20s, she was a major blues jazz singer, along with Bessie Smith, Lil Hardin Armstrong, a whole crew of African-American singers. So I said, I want to write a book about the 1920s that tells a story about African-American community during this time period in Chicago that is not the Great Gatsby. Because usually if people are asked the question, what do you think of when you think of the Roaring 20s? They see Flappers, they see the Great Gatsby. that's not the story I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell about the people in Chicago who looked like me during that time period. And what I discovered in my research during that time period was very exciting. There was a place in Chicago called The Stroll, and that was where on State Street between 30-something and 30-something else, people, there were nightclubs, there were storefront churches, there were speakeasies, and there were gambling joints. There was just a lot of life and excitement. And two of the main characters, or two of the main historical figures that make an appearance in my story, are Louis Armstrong and his wife, who was the queen of the stroll, Lil Hardin Armstrong. So it was really exciting to dig into a story and a community and things that were happening in that city during that time period, even though it was a dual storyline, that was something that was going to be fresh and different from what you might usually read in when it came to a Roaring Twenties story.
When I think of the 20s, I do think primarily of Flappers and The Great Gatsby. When I taught a course at UNC Charlotte on the 1920s, a survey class, and we used The Great Gatsby as social history rather than literature, because it was an interesting look at how certain segments of society lived during that time. But I also think about the post-war effects on the US economy and how everybody else's economy was wrecked. Ours wasn't, because we got into the war so late. And that kind of rippled through in some ways I don't think we really have time to get into tonight. But it's like it might have been Jim said, it was an era of change in a lot of different ways. And some of that change was lasting, and some of that change was good, and some not so much. But it's a really interesting period. And one of my very favorite things in history happened in the 1920s. I am not athletic. I'm a book nerd. I'll own that. That's fine. But one of my favorite things that happened was in 1927, Gertrude Ederle swam the English Channel. And I thought that was so cool when I heard about that as a high school junior. It's like this woman just got in the water and swam across, and really it wasn't quite that simple, but I still think it's pretty cool. So let's take a little bit deeper dive into the subject. And does anybody want to talk about what a flapper or a chic is before we move on?
Actually, Colleen Moore, who was an actress in the silent era and had a very close relationship with King Vidor, was essentially the epitome of the flapper. And the reason they called him flapper was because they wore these boots that with buckles and they didn't buckle them, so they flapped as they walked. So it had a very specific original meaning, but I think it sort of grew to expand and cover like any young person, and especially a young woman who was trying to sort of embrace the modern aspect of womanhood as opposed to the traditional homebody type.
I think that's absolutely true, because some of the articles that I would read in Chicago about Chicago during that time period in the African American community, there was definitely a divide between young women who were experiencing the whole realm of flapperdom, if you will. They were smoking cigarettes, they were getting out at night. You had prohibition, but all of a sudden bars became places where both men and women hung out. There was, but at the same time, there was this other group of people who sort of disdained or really didn't want anything to do with that crowd. And that crowd, for some reason, in Chicago included entertainers. So there was a big article in the Chicago Defender in 1920 something about there was a strike that went on at some of the nightclubs, and some of the dancers, some of the chorus girls were looking for jobs as domestics in African American, wealthier African American households. And they they were like, no, we won't hire them because they're flappers. So that these things, had different meanings, because I'm also working on a book now, or some books, who knows which one, taking place in the 1950s, where there was a whole other thing going on in terms of womanhood post-war, as how society does a shift post World War I, and then another shift post World War II, and then looking at women in particular and their lot in what's going on in the world, and their power structure or lack of power structure is most evident in sort of like that 5-year period in particular, post either World War I or World War II. See a dramatic shift.
Yeah, and
the other thing that happened right at the beginning of the 20s was women got to vote.
Yeah.
It was a huge shift in the way that
white women got to
keep
vote
themselves. Well, yes, that's true.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But still, there was involvement by African American women in the movement, but society did.
And I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and I think one of the things that it's worth remembering is when we look at that period of time coming out of the war, coming out of an age of pandemic, coming out of the U.S. basically going from, and I am looking at this from a U.S. centric perspective, but the U.S. really went to the war late. While there were losses, pretty much the U.S. was one of the few countries in the world that was not touched pretty radically by the war on the home soil. And so you had a lot of industrialization coming around, while you had a lot of people who had come back from the war that had, shell shock and PTSD. They had injuries from the war, things like this. So it was very visible and it was very in front of everybody. We'd had a period of really loss and mourning because everybody had lost somebody in some way, shape, or form during the 19 teens, whether it was disease, whether it was the war, whether any number of the things that all went on during that period of time. The 20s came about and everybody just wanted to feel alive. And I think we see that in the clothes, we see that in the music, we see that in at least in the popular culture, we see a lot of it. But I think it's worth looking at a lot of what we perceive as being the 1920s really was the big cities. It was LA, it was Chicago, it was New York, it was Philadelphia, it was the big urban centers where people dressed up. I mean, it was flappers, it was tuxes, it was tails, top hats. I mean, people wanted to be dressed. They wanted to look good. They wanted to feel good, feel that life, and feel that energy. And I think that's the fashion shows that energy, but I think it also shows a bit of that wanting to flaunt at the establishment, for lack of a better term, on both sides too, just by the nature of it was very expressive. It was very open sexually. It was very open compared to coming out of a repressive period.
Sort of what was it, the Victorian or end of the Victorian into the Georgian or whatever in Britain, I guess. But the other piece of what was happening during that time period included African-American soldiers returning from Europe and facing increased lynchings and prejudices, and the opportunities that were anticipated for Black men returning from the war did not materialize, and in fact went in another direction. We were talking about film a little bit before, talking about filmmaker Oscar Michaud, for example. He's a legendary African-American filmmaker who did silent films and then went on for a lengthy career, even though many of his films were lost through the 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s, if I recall correctly. But the reason I mentioned him during this time period, in 1915, there was a movie called Birth of a Nation. And what it did, because it was pure racist propaganda, it fueled a different type of negativity and brought to the forefront the Ku Klux Klan. And one of the Oscar Michaud's purpose, one of his inspirations initially, was to create films that showed African-American people as people, not caricatures, because of the extreme popularity of that movie. And in thinking about film, one of the questions that I have for my book clubs, when we're talking about Wild Women in the Blues, is really thinking about the time periods where how does film influence society and make changes. So there's one movie that's in the 50s. I'm sorry, it's not the 20s, or maybe it was in the 20s. Did I go away? Oh no, I hit something and my whole screen went away. But what was it? Reefer Madness? When did Reefer Madness?
Reefer Madness
That was
was
the 60s, wasn't it?
yeah,
It
that was
yeah,
60s.
no, it was earlier than the 60s because I remember
There was a
seeing that.
30s version of it.
Yes, there was a 30s version, not just the 60s. But reefer, because what reefer or marijuana, using the word reefer is going back 40s or
Reefer Madness
or something.
was.
Yes, his fingers are on the dial. But that's what, just film and society and how it can, even Easy Rider. Now that's definitely 60s,
Yeah.
but
36, but we'll allow it.
we'll slide it in. But in the 20s, you had the silent era had some significant films, the slapstick comedies of, oh my gosh, I can't name everybody. Buster Keaton, and you have your hero
Marty
behind
and-
you, EJ. Yay!
Well, the Marx Brothers
And-
didn't go into film until the 30s, until the talkies.
Oh, okay.
They were still in vaudeville in the 20s, but yes.
Okay, but didn't Chaplin make some silent movies
In
in
the-
that
Chaplin,
time period?
Harold Lloyd, Buster
Yeah.
Keaton,
Oh, Harold Lloyd.
Fatty Arbuckle,
Oh yes, what a
Norman,
Yep.
yeah,
amazing
Max
story.
Sennett's Keystone Cops, all of this.
Yeah, and all of those had an influence because going back to what you were saying about how there was a society was just striving for gaiety, after the war, after that particular pandemic that was going on from 18 through the late 20s, the strife on other levels throughout the country, and so there was a commitment to entertainment in a way, because think about the sounds of the time. We skirted around it, but jazz was huge, and it was also perceived by some as the devil's music. That's what it was called by some people in the I know in the research that I was doing for my books. I was like laughing. It's like, jazz is the devil's music. It sounded like my mother talking about, rock and roll or something, or actually some other things that I listened to that I probably shouldn't have been listening to anyway. But and anyway, it's always amazing to me. I read a line of information or something, and it said that if you want to time travel, listen to music, because music just takes you through decades, takes you through centuries, from the earliest sounds that someone said was created by somebody back when they were just using rocks and sticks, to Mendelssohn in the 1850s or whomever. So I love entertainment as a vehicle to look at how society is addressing issues, because it's always going to seep through, I feel, into that area. And I was a theater and dance major as well, EJ.
One of the things we talked about on our panel about the Great War is how many movies in the 1920s looked back at the war, like Wings, The Big Parade.
Won the first Oscar, didn't it? Wings.
It did, for best production, as it was known at the time.
Yes.
But as you were talking, Denny, I remembered a movie that is pure fun, and it stars the it girl of the 1920s, Clara Bow.
Yeah.
And she is a department store clerk, and she has a huge crush on the manager of the department store, and hijinks ensue. And she's also in Wings. And so it's quite a contrast between the characters in those two movies, both of which are silent. Because it's much more of a rom-com. It is much more of a rom-com than Wings, which is more serious because it takes place on the Western Front, a lot of it. And she was sort of an embodiment of the "it's time to party" kind of image of the 1920s, I think.
Oh, definitely.
The It Girl.
I mentioned her in the story. I'm sorry, I can ramble. I apologize, EJ. Go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm just saying that Claire Bow, the It Girl, right?
Yes. Yeah.
She's called.
Yeah.
And naturally, now that we're filming, Eleanor Glenn, that's the woman's name, who came up with the concept of it as an all-around sex appeal, attractive aspect of a person. And she actually had a bit part in the movie. They go into a restaurant and Eleanor Glenn kind of marches out in this sort of majestic way and sails across the restaurant and out of the shot. But it was fun to watch it. And it's interesting to think that there was a concept like that of what makes you attractive to, at that point, Hollywood wasn't, I think, so much into acknowledging anything other than male-female relationships. So that was kind of the focus of a lot of those kinds of things. But her career was ruined by the talkies, and it's a shame because she was really good and she was a lot of fun to watch. Since we've kind of taken the dive into movies, EJ, what's one of your favorite movies from the 1920s?
One of the ones that I find just incredibly charming because it's so self-referential. It's actually from a later on in the decade. It's called Show People, and it was directed by King Vidor, and it stars Marion Davies, who is famous or infamous for being William Randolph Hearst's mistress, for virtually all of her life. But Hearst was very protective of her. He financed a lot of her movies, and he didn't want anyone to laugh at her. So he tended to want her to do all of these overblown costume dramas. But she was a brilliant light comedian. And Show People is about a girl played by Marion Davies who comes to Hollywood to make it big, and she encounters another sort of icon in terms of the gay experience. The actor William Haynes is also co-stars in this movie, and the two of them are. He's a star when she comes. He introduces her to the studio. He helps her find her feet, and it's a sort of a Stars Born kind of thing. Her star rises as his diminishes. But King Vidor directed it. He also appears in it, and there's one scene where the Billy Haynes character is showing Marion Davies' character around the studio, and this car comes in with lots of fanfare, and this woman gets out and she says, "Well, who's that?" And he says, "Marion Davies," and she went, "Never heard of her." So it's like this, it was able to reference itself and laugh at itself. And there's also a wonderful scene in the commissary that has almost all of the stars from that particular studio lined up having lunch. So it's a really charming little movie. And Billy Haynes is another very interesting character because he was the top box office draw at MGM in 1928 and 1929. He actually made the jump to talkies, but he was gay and he lived openly with his lover. And it may be sort of apocryphal, but the story is that L.B. Mayer ordered Billy into his office and ordered him to marry a woman, to leave Jimmy, his lover, and marry a woman. And Billy said, "Sure, as soon as you leave your wife." And after that, Billy Haynes's career sort of took a dive. He didn't care. Yeah. He became one of the most successful interior designers in Hollywood. Joan Crawford, among others, and Carol Lombard were some of his clients. And he and Jimmy were together until his death in 1973. And that was that
one. You're gonna write that. You're gonna write that story.
That was one of the inspirations for my books I was in, because I had the example of two men who could begin a relationship in that era and continue and maintain it throughout their lives. So that was.
Well, I'm writing a biographical fiction. That's why I said it like that. It sounds like a lovely story that could be told, and it sounds like you're ready for that. So do that. I'm just giving orders now.
Go forth
The
and write.
movie that the movie that comes to mind for me, I can't do a summary, but it's available on YouTube. It's called Body and Soul by Oscar Michaud. And it's a silent movie that came out in 1925, stars Paul Robeson, who still holds the record for the longest run on Broadway playing Macbeth, if I recall correctly.
You mean the Scottish play?
The Scottish play Macbeth. Yes, and he started.
You can't say that. Of course, we're not in the theater, so that's all right. You can say Macbeth. You don't have to say the Scottish
we
play.
can whisper it. But theater and dance, coming back to roost. But anyway, that's my recommendation from the time period. Check it out. It's on YouTube. It's right there.
Am I correct in thinking that that's the movie in which Robeson plays a double role as a good guy and a con man?
Yes. He plays the minister or preacher and somebody else.
Yeah. It's the cut that I saw a long time ago was very disjointed because the whole movie hadn't been found and it had been kind of reassembled from what they could dig up.
Well, was that Homestead that I can't remember, but Body and Soul is in pretty good shape now. I don't know its history in terms of when or where or what, because so many of Michaud's films are lost. But Body and Soul is there right now in pretty good shape on YouTube. I mean, it's on YouTube, so it's doing fine.
Jim, did you want to add anything about movies, particular movies?
Well, and I mean, we see a lot of really great films starting to come out of the early days of LA and Hollywood and creating that machine. And the other interesting place that was doing a lot in film at the time was Germany.
Yeah.
And so we look a lot of the things that we see in terms of special effects and really explosive storytelling with major effects came out of Germany. We can look at Nosferatu now and how that was struck down, and we can talk about the IP and how that went with with rights. But the other one's Metropolis.
Yeah.
And we look at just the scenes. I mean, I've sat in a theater where they actually played the music live. And it was very much that theater experience to get to watch Metropolis on a big screen and to get back to that sensation, to see some of those special effects, now that they've recovered most of the film. I mean, we there's a couple of different cuts of it out there, but I mean, now that we get to see the film and the special effects and the story, and we look at how much of the language that came from that. I mean, the word robot, came from Metropolis. This is something that may, Czech word meaning forced labor that is snuck into our language now and is so much of everything we see and do. The idea that a film that's almost 100 years old had that big of a cultural influence on really the world. And to know that that engine that was creating all of that is later part of the engine that created so much of the propaganda and the films that we see in Nazi Germany not too many years later. It's the same filmmakers frequently that we find that created some of these grand films and presentations and the effects that kind of set the standard for the industry, to then see what that became later on in terms of the propaganda engine. But that film for me, I mean, I've got a couple of different versions of it beyond what you can find on YouTube, but to have sat and watched that in the theater and to see that sense of blending of technology and humanity and that question of where do the two fall, and that idea of what was becoming a technological society and they didn't know how to deal with that. I think we can see a lot of that right now, what we're going through today in terms of e-commerce and digital world and digital technology and AI and robotics. Wait, are we repeating the 1920s again?
Did you see that one? Oh, I digress. There was this one robot on the news the other day that scared the mess out of me. It was so lifelike. I kept watching it, waiting for the man to step out from the costume. It was real weird.
I saw some clips of that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So it wasn't just my imagination. There was another movie, and it might not have been in the 20s, but
with Peter
was
Lorre.
it Hitchcock or Pete? What did?
Peter Lorre was in it, wasn't it?
Peter Lorre.
He was the
Yeah,
murderer.
maybe that was
Was it-
later.
Yeah, I think it was it because as I recall,
Was that M for
It was
Murder?
Peter Lorre because he was in Casablanca, but this is his early career
Mhm.
back in Germany, I believe. It was scary. That's all I remember.
I'm trying to
You know,
remember.
there's one note of sour among the cream in the movie industry of the 1920s is that the public was so appalled by some of the decadent things in movies, scantily clad women and, you know, people partying and drinking and all the things that we've already talked about, that they created the Haynes board to censor movies in 1922. And it looks like EJ knows something about that. So you want to share that with us?
There were two scandals that happened in Hollywood simultaneously: Fatty Roscoe Arbuckle's trial and William Desmond Taylor's murder. And those two things ignited such a moral conflagration that, well, and there had been also, you know, among all of the, you know, the church groups and everything across the country, and censorship. All of the various distributors could censor any movie that came across their threshold to be shown. And because the movie industry and the producers were so terrified that the government was going to impose censorship on them, that they voluntarily chose to say, we'll police it ourselves. And they're the ones who invited Hayes in. They sort of sowed the seeds of their own destruction, even though for most of the 20s, it wasn't really enforced very much because Hayes was kind of spineless. He used to be the postmaster general. He had a list of things called do's, don'ts, and be carefuls. Right around the time the talkies came in, he got an assistant who was a little sterner, and he's the one who really started enforcing the production code.
Now, is that what gave us the production code of 1930?
It started there, and it didn't end until the 60s, I don't think. I think it was
You know,
right
that's
around.
kind of what the comic book industry did. You know,
Yeah.
Wortham's The Seduction of the Innocent, about how comic books were leading children to become juvenile delinquents. There were Senate hearings, and the comic book industry got upset, and they went, we know, we'll have a comics code authority and we'll have rules that people have to follow. And that held through until about the late 1960s. But I don't want to get started on that, because if I get started on that, I'll go for a while on it. But we're coming up.
Don't go.
Yeah. We've got a few more minutes left. Is there anything that anybody wants to talk about that we haven't touched on yet?
So many things.
One of the things
Yeah.
that I found really interesting when I was reading first about William Desmond Taylor, for instance, is you forget how easy it is, you know, or how difficult it was comparable to now for people to travel from one place to another. I mean, it took them a long time. Not only that, but it was really, really easy for people to disappear and reinvent themselves. And that's pretty much what Hollywood was about. I mean, there were so many people. William Desmond Taylor himself was someone who abandoned a family in New York, reinvented himself, showed up in Hollywood as someone completely different. And the only reason his original family were able to find him was because he was foolish enough to appear as an extra in a movie, and they saw him on the screen.
That's crazy.
So
Now,
if
when you said disappear,
don't go on the
my
movie.
book, Wild Women in the Blues, that's a definite thing I use about the ease at which you can appear and disappear from time, place, and show up as somebody else. And it was very easy to do when back in that, well, it was definitely very easy for African-American community to have people who did that sort of thing, but across the board, the world was just different, tracked differently. Now I can go in, for example, my grandfather on my mother's side, I went through the census to see, and what, since he could not read and he never let us know that he couldn't read. I found this out after he was dead, because my grandmother would stand behind the chair he sat in and just start talking about what was in the newspaper. and he'd hold it. It was, just stuff. But anyway, my point here is that he kept, in every census, he had a different country he was from. Eventually, I found that he was AWOL from a merchant sea ship. He was a merchant seaman, and he was AWOL listed from a ship in 1920, I think, is what I found. So it was just, he totally disappeared and ended up someplace else. It was cool.
Well, I mean, if you look at everybody coming in via Ellis Island, that just kind of got slapped with a, here's your new name. We can't say that. We can't write it. We're just going to give you, here's your new name.
Yeah.
Names and identity were very different back then. And that idea of picking up and saying, yeah, I no longer like being that person. I'm going to go remake myself. Short of showing up on the big screen, you pretty much could go and disappear and build yourself an entire brand new life.
Imagine trying to do that today with social media.
That's actually a good place to break. We're coming up on time. So if each of you will tell everybody where they can find information about you and about your work, and if there's anything you want to highlight that's recently out or coming up, please do that. And EJ, we'll start with you.
You can find me at my website, ejrussell.com. That's EJRUSSELL, all one word. My most recent releases are a series of cozy mysteries with a gay protagonist. The first one is called 5 Dead Herrings. The second one is The Hound of the Burgervilles. And the third one is about to come out, and it's The Lady Under the Lake. My single historical novel set in the 1920s is called Silent Sin.
Denny?
Denny S. Bryce. Bryce is spelled BRYC as in cat E. Denny S. Bryce is my website, my Instagram, my Facebook, my Twitter. It's all the same. Books, Wild Women in the Blues is available from Kensington Books, and it's everywhere books are sold. Target, Barnes and Noble, all the places. And indie bookstores. I have to do a shout out for indie bookstores nationwide. You have a favorite indie bookstore in your community, go there and shop. In the Face of the Sun, my second historical fiction will be out April 26th. It's a dual timeline set in 1928 Los Angeles, but it actually starts in 1928 Los Angeles and 1968, June of 1968. And some of my characters are taking a road trip from Chicago to LA on Route 66. So that story is in the Face of the Sun.
Jim?
You can find me at jamespnettles.com, authoressentials.net. You can find me I've got a couple of new workshops that'll be coming out on Author Essentials and on the Speculative Fiction Academy. The author business plan should be dropping sometime in the next couple of weeks, along with intellectual property. In terms of book releases, hypothetically coming out in February, the We Folk in Film, where my essay in that piece is on the 84 version of Dune and how it relates to fairy folk and fairy mythology.
Ooh.
So I think that's the next thing that comes out. And of course here, because they never let me leave.
You can find me here at ConTinual. My website is nancynorthcott.com. I do have a Facebook author group, but I tend to forget that I do, so you won't find much relevant there. Frequently on Twitter, and I probably spend more time than is good for me, and I'm at Nancy Northcott there. And my next release, which will be out by the time this is posted, is Mage Sentinel, and it's a reissue of the first book in my Light Mage Wars series, which is about mages fighting ghouls and demons to protect humanity in southern Georgia, the state, not the republic. And that is the first of 3. Then the second book will be out in February. and the third book in March. And I'm really excited about that because they reverted to me, and I'm a control freak, so I'm in control of everything, and there we go. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us, and thank you to everyone who was on the panel. We really appreciate it. And you can always find us on the panel room at ConTinual.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.